Welcome to the Ghost Stories YouTube channel. Here, we will bring you the scariest experiences through ghost stories, mysteries, and inexplicable mysteries of the mysterious world. Whether you are someone who enjoys learning about ghost stories or simply looking for a new entertainment experience, our channel will be the ideal destination. Join us in the horror space and get ready for the most tense and scary moments. Don't forget to press the subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss any new videos. Thank you for joining the Ghost Stories YouTube channel, and now, get ready for some spooky moments with us.
The Ghost Hair. It is now 11:15 p.m. You are listening to FM 91 MH station of VOV traffic radio station. It's late at night, those who are still on the road whether for work or Phew. Truong slapped the button to turn off the radio in the car. His mood is very bad now, anxiety makes his forehead furrow tightly, sweat drips down his temples and his eyes hidden behind his glasses show a restless look. From time to time he looked at his watch, his hand holding the steering wheel tightened. The road ahead was empty and dark. The light from the front of the car shone about 5 meters away. The road was deserted, so Truong stepped on the gas pedal even more, and the car sped away into the night. About 2 hours ago, the hospital announced that his fiancée had escaped from the hospital room. She didn't come home, nor did she pick up the phone, so they had to call him. Truong thought about it and his heart was on fire. He was afraid she would do something foolish. She was currently being treated for leukemia. After several radiation treatments, her hair fell out until her scalp was bare. The doctors also discovered that Truong's fiancée was suffering from early depression, a very dangerous psychological disease. They gave her medication but the situation has made almost no progress. The hospital encouraged combining psychological effects with medication to improve her condition. Most of the melancholy that arose in Truong's fiancée was because she was afraid he would annul the marriage and abandon her after everything. Truong is aware of his great responsibility, he always arranges time to visit her, at least once every 2 days. But not today, he had an unexpected business trip, so he could only call and talk to his fiancée. She silently hung up immediately after. At that time, Truong suddenly had a very bad feeling about this matter. Until a few hours ago, when he received a call from the hospital, Truong immediately drove home to find her. Ring. While deep in thought, the phone in front of me suddenly lit up, and the screen displayed the caller's name. Is she? Truong immediately picked up the phone to answer, his voice said quickly as if shouting. Where are you? You. Mr. Truong. Save me. The sound of the girl sobbing intermittently through the phone, reaching Truong's ears, was like an electric shock to his brain. As he turned his gaze from under the steering wheel to the window, in the light of the headlights, suddenly appeared an object. Before he could calm down, the car rushed forward, the thing was immediately hit. The tip of its head smashed straight into the car window. Truong quickly threw his phone aside, held the steering wheel with both hands, released the accelerator, and stepped on the brake as hard as he could, but still could not prevent the collision. The thing in front of me seemed to shatter into a pile stuck on the glass window, not blood. At that moment he realized it was an object, definitely not water splashing on the car window. That thing was soft and separated into thin strands. Truong's own eyes could see it sliding down, as if it were a head full of hair slowly falling off the glass. Until the car completely stopped, he was still shocked by what had just happened. The next process was even faster. While Truong was still observing, the strange object took action. To be exact, it moved along the left side of the glass, at lightning speed. The thin threads joined together and moved automatically, and in a blink of an eye, The glass door in front of him was empty. Truong kept his eyes straight for a few seconds. He wondered if that thing was hair. If it was hair, then it must have grown from a certain head. He may have hit a pedestrian, who just fell to the left side of the car. Immediately, he opened the door, but to his surprise, there was not a single trace of impact outside. No one fell onto the road, there was nothing on the left side of the car, there was nothing in the undercarriage of the car. All around, besides the light emitted from the car's headlights, there was only darkness. Truong frowned. If a collision happened at such a speed, the person who was hit must have had their bones broken. How could they leave so quickly? Suddenly he was cold. There was a feeling of doubt in Truong's head. When the car crashed into that place, he was sure he didn't hear a sound, and didn't feel any vibrations outside. It's like the car just crashes through the air. Suddenly Truong looked in front of the glass. There was still a lot of hair still stuck to the windshield wiper. They were long and black. Truong felt like they could move. Each strand wriggled like a tentacle. They were all clinging to the door. The glass is wrapped around the car's mirror. But after looking back, he couldn't see anything anymore. That bit of hair was now hanging down, but when he looked at it, he still felt a little creepiness on the back of his neck. I thought this was a bit unusual. He was completely conscious when he saw the car hit that thing. Wait, stepped back when that thing appeared. Truong pursed his lips. Could it be that he was looking at it wrong at that moment? A flash of light suddenly appeared. It seemed to fly from the right side. He was driving past and accidentally crashed into it. A clump of hair flew from the right. Truong glanced to the right. It was an empty field. How could the strand of hair appear there? Furthermore, where is it flying to? Truong thought and felt his back was cold. To the left of where it crawled, was behind him. Truong didn't dare turn around to look directly. He glanced in the car mirror. He couldn't see anything behind, but it was best to leave here. He quickly got into the car, closed the door and started the engine. Suddenly remembering the unfinished call with Mai, Truong looked around and saw that he had dropped his phone on the floor of the car. The call has ended. He called back a few times but couldn't get through. His worries were now rising as densely as the night before his eyes. She's calling for help, Truong thought, not daring to imagine what terrible things could happen to Mai. Now where to go to find her? While confused, Truong searched the phone book for people related to Mai. Suddenly he remembered Huang. This person worked at the switchboard. He could ask him to look up the call location or where the last signal of her phone number came from. Truong immediately called Huang. Luckily it was during his duty hours. After listening to his brief explanation, Huang agreed to help him find it and said he would report back to him immediately when he had the results. Truong continued driving to the hospital. He wanted to know before leaving if his fiancée had any unusual symptoms. It must be said that at that time he was very nervous, but his intuition was not focused forward. Occasionally Truong still glanced at the left glass door. He felt that the hair just now was very familiar. It's not that he once bought Mai a wig, jet black, waist length, equal to the length of the hair out there. Thinking back, there have been a lot of strange things happening recently, making him suspect that they are all related to the word hair. Tukan Mai, 26 years old, was diagnosed with stage 2 leukemia. Before that, Mai was busy preparing for the wedding that was about to be held next month. An unfortunate incident happened when she went to her husband's house to prepare invitations. Suddenly, her eyes lit up and the world turned dark. Her nose bled and she immediately collapsed unconscious. The wedding was postponed indefinitely. The hospital required radiotherapy for 6 months, and they reminded the family to be mentally prepared to encourage the patient. Mai knew it was very possible that her husband's family would not agree to continue the wedding. The doctors also said that her chance of conceiving was very low, and she did not have enough blood to supply the fetus. Before that terrible emotional storm, Truong was always by her side to take care of her, giving her the motivation to enter the difficult stage of treatment. Since when did he become her life? So after 2 months of radiotherapy, seeing him visit regularly every day, she felt much calmer. Until the 3rd month, when Mai began to show signs of side effects after radiotherapy, her skin was dry and cracked and her hair fell out. By the 4th month, large patches of hair were clearly visible on her scalp, and her hair was also completely thin. Mai gradually became afraid that Truong might still come to visit her, but when he saw her like that, he would definitely feel disgusted. Mai always thought that he was gradually avoiding her, looking at her less and less, either looking away or looking at his phone. She used to think that if she lost all her hair, he would probably abandon her. He was 32 years old. If she didn't recover quickly, maybe her family would urge him to marry someone else. At that time, she knew what to do, what identity could she use to keep him, and then her life did not know where to go. That thought pushed Mai into depression. She didn't want to see anyone, didn't want to talk to anyone, other than Truong. Her possessiveness has never been so intense. It seems like every second and minute, Mai wants to possess him for herself. She becomes wary of everyone around her and no longer trusts anyone. Doctors discovered Mai's depression some time later, when she was almost inert to all external influences. They gave her medicine, but for a long time there was still no improvement. Mai is haunted by her hair that is falling out every day. Now the disease has turned into a hostile phase. She attacked the doctors. They accidentally discovered that the drugs she normally had to take were all being let into the slits of the bed. She just held them in her mouth without swallowing. After the doctors left, Mai immediately spit out the medicine and stuffed it in all the places around the bed. The amount of medicine found under the bed was so much that it could be grabbed into a handful. That's why treating Mai's depression became difficult. Truong is the only person she trusts. She listens to every word he says. The doctors met with him to discuss her situation. Truong understood what he had to do. He tried to spend more time taking care of Mai, talking to her as much as possible to help her relax, most of all. In addition, he also promised that as long as she recovered from her illness, the two would have a wedding. There was a concern in my heart for a long time. When she heard these words, she spoke up and confessed. My hair is falling out like that. Can I still be a bride? Lost hair can grow back. The important thing is your health. Only by taking medicine will you get better quickly. When your hair grows long, we will get married, Truong replied lovingly. No, I want to leave the hospital and get married. Truong looked at Mai's earnest eyes at that time. He smiled and said, "Do you want me to give you a gift?" "Yes, I like all your gifts." "Then I will give it to you, but now you should quickly take the medicine, the doctor is about to come in to check." What Truong thought of was a wig similar to Mai's previous hair. She has always been proud of her long, silky black hair, but now Mai has become like that partly because of the shock of losing that pride. He will order her an identical wig, hoping that when she puts it on, Mai will regain her spirit, and can also temporarily use this method to help her gain confidence and continue treatment. On the way back, Truong thought hard about that plan. Long, shiny black hair that feels soft to the touch. I think so, but it's a bit difficult to imagine. If there were actual images here, Truong would probably be less confused. At the same time, the street light just turned red. He stopped the car. Right in front was a bus. Truong glanced through the back window of the car. Suddenly he stopped. Sitting in the last row were 3 people, all female, 2 of them tied their hair, only one person sitting in the middle had her hair loose. The other person's hair was long, covering his back, jet black and straight. Coincidentally, Truong was thinking about such hair, he was immediately attracted to it. But looking for a moment, he suddenly noticed something unreasonable. The other person was sitting in the bus, the windows were tightly closed, the air conditioner was running from top to bottom, so why was that person's hair flying backwards from the bottom up, almost reaching his neck? If you look closely, it doesn't look like you're flying, it's like someone is constantly flipping your hair from the bottom up, the movement repeating endlessly. Just like that, his hair flew up and then fell down again. What was even more surprising was that the other person still sat still. After 60 seconds of the red light, Truong did not take his eyes off that strange scene. Perhaps it was because she used her hand to push her hair, but her arms were still hanging down and her shoulders were the same, meaning that Truong encountered a second surprise at the same time. He saw that the girl's posture was somewhat unusual. Compared to the 2 people sitting next to her, her shoulders and arms were almost steep. Normally, when sitting, her shoulders would be perpendicular to her body. Even when standing, her shoulders would still be raised. Hanging down like that is neither standing nor sitting. It could just be a hang-up. In Truong's mind, the image of a hanged person appeared, his whole body suspended, his shoulders slumped down, his arms pressed close to his body, his head bent and his neck pulled askew by the weight of the body. Suddenly goosebumps filled his arms, the car's air conditioner hit his face coldly, his eyes stared at the girl with flying hair in the bus. And yet, the scariest thing while looking at that hair was that Truong suddenly discovered that this girl had no nape, or rather, he saw that her hair kept flying up and down, feeling like it wasn't attached to her scalp. Hidden behind the hair was a dark space. He glanced up and took a moment to see half of his face peeking out. The other person's face was bowed deeply, his chin touched the base of his neck, he could only see from his forehead to the bridge of his nose. Truong was so scared that his face turned pale, his heart trembled with fear. A dead person was hanging on the bus, she was still face to face with him. Again, the 2 people next to him didn't seem to see anything strange. From time to time they turned to each other and said a few words, sometimes even giggling. Bim! Bim! There was a loud beeping sound from behind. Vuong looked in the rearview mirror, many cars were impatiently flashing their lights at him, the green light had already turned on, the other bus had already gone dozens of meters away. Truong stepped on the gas pedal, he drove the car slowly. Although he really wanted to pass, the closer he got, the more confused he became. Curiosity made him raise his eyes to the back window of the bus again. The 3 of them were still sitting there, the 2 people next to them were talking very enthusiastically, but at the same time, Truong saw the girl turn her face to the side, smiling and talking, her head tilted as if listening to their story. She's really alive, she even still runs her hand through her hair when she's excited, her sitting posture is completely natural, especially her hair, it doesn't fly up. Truong pressed the gas pedal and his car sped forward. For a moment he suspected he had seen wrongly, but that was too unreasonable. Recalling the scene a few minutes ago, he was attracted by that long, straight black hair, then the ghostly images appeared. It's impossible to find a more suitable excuse, simply because you've thought too much about an issue, like here the hair thing, naturally, associations will arise in your mind that can build up. Positive or negative, mainly to achieve that goal. This is called auto-suggestion. There's pressure in my head, which is probably why those strange images appear. Even so, Truong still didn't understand why he thought of a hanging dead person. The thing that haunted him most was that person's long hair. He suddenly shivered. He wanted to buy a wig, but it wasn't human hair. Die like that. A few days later, Truong went to a hair store to order a set for Mai. The shop owner warmly welcomed him. He introduced that this shop had 30 years of experience sewing wigs, which means using hair attached to a layer of skin-colored fabric. The skill is very high, with the naked eye you cannot distinguish between truth and falsehood. Hair materials are also diverse. Cheap ones are made of nylon fibers, expensive ones are made of real human hair. Hearing that, Truong felt a little guilty. He didn't understand much about wig-making technology, so he asked where he could get real human hair. The shop owner brought a wig made of real human hair to show him, saying that when people grow their hair long and cut it, there will be some ladies who will buy their hair. After selling it back to him, the quality of the hair is usually very good. Truong tried to stroke the fake hair. It felt very soft, each strand was shiny, the hair roots were firmly sewn into the skin-colored fabric, not much different from real hair. The two talked for a while longer, and before leaving, Truong agreed to order a wig made of real human hair at his shop. No matter the shape or size, he carefully instructed them, and if there was even a slight mistake, he would not take it. It was already evening when he left the restaurant. Truong got in the car to visit Mai at the hospital. He informed her that the gift he was preparing was about to be completed. In just 5 days, she would receive a big surprise. Because of this, Mai's spirit has also improved significantly. The doctors said that Mai has diligently taken her medicine and talked to everyone. She happily told about the secret gift he was preparing for her, and their wedding afterward. A few hours passed quickly. The hospital announced that visiting hours were over. Truong stood up to say goodbye to Mai and then went to the underground parking garage. The hospital's exit from the parking garage is located behind the row of medical examination and treatment rooms. Across the aisle is a special building. The first floor is the morgue and crematorium. The second, third, and fourth floors are used to store human specimens and practice anatomy. The atmosphere here when it's dark is very gloomy. Just having to walk a short distance to the main gate makes Truong feel uncomfortable. His car was parked in a dark corner, next to a 4-seater white Lexus. There was light in the car. Someone must have just entered the car. They were about to leave like him. Truong thought for a moment and pressed the car lock. As he passed the other end of the car, he glanced slightly at the person inside. Suddenly his feet stopped. The light from the car's ceiling lights revealed an extremely horrifying scene. The person inside had his hands hanging next to him, his head tilted back. Because the light was so clear, Truong could see that it was a woman, with long loose hair covering the back of the chair, right in the middle of that person's face. A hole was punched from the front of the face to the back of the head. The hole was as big as a child's fist, as if it had been stabbed by an iron pipe. Blood drenched the shirt he was wearing. The other person's eyes widened at the ceiling of the car, blood flowed from his eye sockets to his ears, his shoulders still twitched a few times from time to time. After each convulsion, more blood spurted out. Truong was scared to death by the scene before his eyes. He wanted to call someone but couldn't, his throat was choked. Witnessing such a horrifying tragedy, everyone would feel panic. Truong looked around frantically for help. He was so scared that he didn't know what to do, his hands kept shaking. His mind was spinning and his throat was indescribably nauseous. In the midst of that sudden psychological shock, a question suddenly flashed in Truong's mind: is she dead? To be sure, he turned around again. With such a serious injury, she must have died instantly. But, At the same time, he saw the woman's head moving. The frequency of fluctuations was incredibly fast. The field of vision focused on the hole in that person's face, feeling like something terrible was hidden inside. His hand involuntarily tightened, almost forgetting his fear. He wanted to know what was inside her head. Blood splattered everywhere, on the car's windshield, steering wheel, and passenger seat next to it. The woman shook her head violently as if sitting in an electric chair, occasionally flying out a few crushed pieces of brain like the residue of a passenger's head. Truong's heart pounded loudly in his chest. He leaned forward in front of the car, straining his eyes to see the ghostly scene ahead. Cohen. Truong was startled and quickly took a few steps back. Cold sweat covered his forehead, his eyes still filled with horror at the scene that had just occurred. The car's headlights turned on. He was blinded by it. He quickly used his hand to block the light. Truong squinted and looked through his fingers. The woman in the car was holding the steering wheel. Her face was completely intact, without a single scratch on it. He dropped his hand in surprise, his eyes staring blankly at the person in the car. She saw him standing in front of the exit for so long, even glancing at the car many times with a very strange attitude, an uncomfortable look on his face. Annoyed, the woman pressed the horn several times. The whole car was filled with shrill sirens. The sound was loud enough for Truong to recover. He realized he was standing in front of the woman's car, so he quickly stepped aside. Until the other car left, Truong kept thinking about what he saw a few minutes ago. So real, he thought to himself. The feeling of trembling with fear was still there, his heart was still beating like a drum in his chest. Truong suddenly remembered. Before he was blinded by the light, he saw something more horrifying than anything else, causing that image to be engraved in his brain. Hair, a lot of hair, poured out from the hole in the woman's face, as if it had eaten the person's head, then flowed out with the blood. Suddenly, like a small waterfall, the bloody hair filled the hole. It extended all the way to her chest. But it's all just imagination, Truong sighed, probably because his work recently hasn't been good. The stress of the day has made him too tired. Unconsciously, he raised his hand to pinch his eyelids, feeling a bit dissatisfied. Truong got into the car. He didn't go home right away but ran to a small pub. There was no music inside, no customers, and a few people he knew were drinking there. So he joined them. This method of relief was simple but surprisingly effective. Very soon he forgot some of the obsession. Drinking a little felt much more comfortable. When the new day dawned, the clock struck 1 a.m., Truong returned home, feeling light in his heart. 5 days later, he returned to the hairdresser's shop and the owner brought him the wig he had ordered. The length, style, color, he really thought it was perfect. In Truong's mind he thought when Mai wore it, how happy she would feel. Because he still had work to do, he put his hair in the car. At the end of the day, when he got home, he remembered it. Truong thought it was too late and the hospital wouldn't let her visit anymore. He'd come over and give it to Mai tomorrow. The wig was neatly placed in a paper box. Truong entered the house. He put it on the table and went to change clothes. In the bathroom, he splashed water on his face. When the water was gone, he looked at his face in the bed. His eyes had dark circles and his cheeks were visibly hollow. Maybe he should pay a little attention to his health. Suddenly Truong was startled. There was a shadow of a person just appearing. He was sure he wasn't mistaken. The mirror was placed opposite the bathroom door. From that door, go straight to the large window facing the outdoors. On the door there was a frosted glass frame, bright light. The light from the opposite building could pass through the glass, but suddenly a dark shadow obscured that beam of light. Truong regained his composure. He turned around. The light from outside was still shining through. The black shadow was nowhere to be seen. Truong looked for a moment, sure he didn't see anything. He thought maybe it was someone just walking on the street, so he felt secure and continued washing his face. This is the 10th floor, there is no balcony outside, how can you walk around? Truong immediately raised his face. In the mirror was that black shadow again, now it was clearly printed on the prayer plate. He saw that it was an elongated head, or rather it looked like a person with loose hair standing against him. Into the glass. Truong was restless, he turned around, his head felt like it was about to explode. It was clear that the black shadow was standing right there, but in just a few seconds it had disappeared. He was confused, his eyes looked at the glass for a long time, but as soon as he glanced into the mirror, he saw that black shadow appear. The lines in the mirror were extremely clear, that head seemed to be hanging right outside the door. Truong picked up the small scissors in the tray. He suspected that someone had broken into the room, that person was standing outside the door. He guessed that he was in here so he didn't notice, he had to act before he did anything, otherwise later that person would come in with a weapon and his life would be in danger. Truong grabbed the handle on the door, swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and nervously tightened the scissors. Bang, one sound. The bathroom door was wide open. Truong stood in a defensive position in front of the door, scissors pointed out, but in front of him was completely empty. He glanced left and right, turned on all the room lights, every corner around was illuminated. Stepping out of the bathroom, Truong quietly walked around the bedroom, out to the living room, in the kitchen, not seeing anything strange, looking around, his eyes landed on the box on the glass table. The lid of the box was lifted up, creating a gap half the size of a hand. Truong frowned. When did he open it? Since he brought it into the house, he hadn't touched that box, but if he hadn't opened it, who would have come in to dispel that unreasonable thought? Truong naturally admitted that he had opened the lid of the box. He went to check around the house a few more times, making sure there was no one, before Truong returned to the living room. He sat on the chair, looked at the opened box, intending to close it tightly, but when he lifted the lid of the box, his hair fell out as well, the ends of his hair falling onto the table like a human head falling there. Truong smoothed it neatly, he lifted the hair, the texture was beautiful, silently complimenting it. Suddenly his hand slid into the stream of hair, each smooth strand seemed to cling to his hand. Feeling soft and cool, anyone who has ever touched silk will think this is very similar to that luxurious material. Staring at it for a while, under the gentle light, the silky hair seemed to come alive, making the viewer want to caress it forever. Suddenly he heard a news alert on his phone. Because he was busy with work and didn't have much time to follow the news, he installed an application to read the newspaper at the end of the day on his phone. Truong took her hair and went to the clothes hanger to get her phone. He didn't want his hair to be curled, so he hung it on a hook, right on top of his shirt. At first glance, it looked like someone was standing with his head bowed, hanging his hair down. Superstitious people are often very taboo about doing that. Truong didn't pay attention, his hand held the phone and scrolled through, many headlines appeared. Suddenly he saw a headline that caught his eye: female student commits suicide in private room. The post is about a young girl. 10 days ago her relatives found her dead in her bedroom, her neck hanging from a rope hanging from the ceiling. In particular, she held a pair of scissors in one hand and a long strand of hair in the other. Most people have questions about this detail, because the dead person has short hair that only reaches the nape of the neck, while the other hair must be waist length. Reading the comments below, they believe that the girl was murdered. Although there were no signs of a struggle, the hair was most likely cut from the perpetrator's head. Others objected, if it was indeed the murderer's hair, why didn't that person get rid of it? Wouldn't leaving the scene like that be too obvious, or did that person want to challenge the law? Truong stared at the photo of the scene that was being passed around by the online community. He found this image very familiar, as if he had seen it not long ago. The girl hung high, her shoulders and arms hanging down, her head bowed to her neck. The only difference was that her hair was long that time, sometimes reaching her waist. That was it. This was very similar to the time he saw a man and woman sitting in the back of the bus, in the same position. The image on the phone suddenly moved before Truong's eyes. Instead of a stiff body, he saw the girl smiling, her hand stroking her hair, then her face suddenly distorted, her hand holding scissors struggling to cut her long hair. But after just one pull, the girl went crazy. The rope came from somewhere around her neck and jerked her body upside down. The girl's arms and legs relaxed and swung like a pendulum. Truong's hand trembled. He immediately left that article. His finger moved to another news item, but before he could completely panic, his eyes saw a headline: iron pipe at construction site fell from above, causing one person died in the accident. His hand automatically clicked on the article, the first photo recorded at the scene. He realized that it was a four-seater white Lexus. The front window had been shattered by a steel pipe. They did not take a close-up of the victim, only saw a steel pipe penetrating from the outside deep into the car. Blood splattered all over the windows and around the seats. The writer identified the victim as a woman. In the photo, you can see her arms hanging on the side of the chair, from shoulder to chest covered in blood, with her head tilted back. Truong looked confused. Was this the woman he saw in the hospital tunnel? She really had an accident. 5 days ago he found her dead. The accident happened 2 days ago. Calculating the gap between what he saw and what actually happened was 3 days. What is the connection here? Truong thought, his scalp tingling. The photo of that woman when she was still alive, her hair covering her face. Suddenly he saw a mysterious hair appear. What role does it play in the story? He looked away from the phone screen. In front of him was the window glass reflecting the image behind him. Suddenly he noticed the clothes hanger again. The long black hair had disappeared. Truong's heart skipped a beat. He thought he had dropped the phone he was holding in his hand. He immediately turned around. The hook was empty. Truong squinted. It turned out her hair was lying on the ground, a few steps away from him. It fell from the clothes hanger, the head facing him. No matter how you look at it, it's just a piece of inanimate hair. There's no way it could kill someone. Since when did he become so afraid of shadows and the wind? Moreover, this hair doesn't look dangerous. Truong sighed. He bent down to pick up the hair, brushed it a bit. It was indeed very normal. He carefully put it in the box and tightly closed the lid. Fatigue made him not want to think about anything else. Now he just wanted to sleep deeply and forget all the problems in his head. The next day, Truong brought a gift box to give to Mai. He thought he would see her happy face, but Mai just stared at it, her expression somewhat surprised. He wanted her to wear it. Mai looked at him so eagerly. How could she refuse? After straightening his hair, the two looked in the mirror and his face brightened. In contrast to Truong's feelings, Mai's face became more and more pale. Her two eyes were stunned, and her expression showed fear. At that moment, Mai pulled her hair down, not daring to look in the mirror anymore. Before that action, Truong was extremely surprised and asked, "Don't you like this hair? I tried to put it the same as your old hair." Mai raised her frightened eyes to look at him. While panicking, she heard, "Don't you like me?" "No such thing. Why don't you like me?" She quickly grabbed his hands, almost crying voice. Yes, I like it very much. He looked at her with sadness. Perhaps Mai couldn't accept this reality yet, he should give her time to get used to that big change. Truong hugged Mai's shaking shoulders, he tightened his arms around her small back, she leaned close to his chest, sobbing. Hear his voice echoing through his chest. I understand, don't rush, you will gradually get used to it, when you recover, we will get married. If your hair doesn't grow in time, you can use this hair temporarily, you will still be the bride. You're most beautiful, don't worry about anything. Truong's warm words, if it were before, would have made her faint in happiness, but now, why did her heart waver like that? An invisible fear gradually overwhelmed my thoughts. The thing that scared her just now was so obvious, could it be that he didn't see it in the mirror? It wasn't Mai with long, straight hair. The face she saw was completely different, making her scared, actually, because she knew who it was. There was a time when she liked to cause fights in school, then an incident happened, she almost completely changed, the current person was formed after that change. What could cause a person to change so suddenly? That matter involves human life, whether indirectly or directly killing another person, the feeling is the same. When Truong said goodbye to her to leave the hospital, Mai immediately threw her hair in the box, she did not dare to do so in his presence. She knew he had specially bought it for her, there was no way she would disappoint him, maybe he would become bored, and that's why he left her, so it was her fault, it was definitely her fault. That came out. Mai immediately closed the lid of the paper box and stuffed it under the hospital bed. Only then did she dare to glance into the mirror. Suddenly, she saw that her face was both pale and ugly, the feeling in her mouth was bitter, the medicine she had just taken was choking in her throat. It made her so uncomfortable that she had to immediately run to the bathroom and use her hand to reach into her throat to vomit it all out. It's because of this medicine, Mai thought, the doctors didn't tell her what the medicine was for, they forced her to take it every day, making her body look so hideous. A feeling of hatred welled up in Mai's heart. Just now she saw the nurse talking and laughing with Truong. Was she flirting with him? You are such an attractive type of man, surely she will want to flirt with you. She clutched her chest and panted, her teeth clenched. Just thinking about that made Mai wish to rush forward and bite her, leaving her no face to see him again. That evening, when it was time to take the medicine, Mai was sitting on the bed. The nurse came and gave her medicine and water to drink. Again, she used the old trick, she held them in her mouth. The nurse thought Mai's illness had improved, so she didn't pay attention. After she left, Mai immediately spit out all the pills, stuffed them down the bed, and then gingerly followed them to the door. Outside was a nurse standing and taking notes. She stood with her back to Mai. She saw the nurse's long hair swaying. Looking at it, she just wanted to rush forward and cut it off. Back to bed. Mai lay facing the wall, she glared at the cold white in front of her, her eyes darkened. Little did Mai know, when the nurse left, an object crawled out from under the bed. The long strands of hair were wrapped around each other like arms, spreading out into a dark shadow across the floor. It wanted to crawl onto the edge of the bed, but suddenly Mai put her feet down and put on slippers, and for a moment the black shadow immediately retreated. It silently crouched deep under the bed, returned to the opened box and lay still there. The sound of hair rustling against the paper sounded like hundreds of thousands of centipede legs crawling around, and even more like the sound of hands groping to get out of a tight space. After 2 days of not taking the medicine, Mai began to lose sleep. Every night when she closed her eyes, nightmares immediately came. Every time it's the same image, over and over again, no matter how hard I try to push it out of my thoughts, My still sees it constantly. That was the past that she wanted to bury a long time ago, 10 years ago, when my was still a high school girl. Possessiveness was an instinct that broke out from that day on. She fell in love with a senior and only wanted him to be hers. So when she saw him being close to another girl, she was very angry. After meeting her a few times, that girl immediately became a thorn in my side. Then one late afternoon, when returning from school, my blocked that girl's path, threatened and beat her. Even more cruel, my also used scissors to cut off that girl's long hair, no matter how hard she tried to explain and apologize. My was blinded by jealousy, unable to control her tongue, causing a disaster. The girl fell into a state of extreme panic. She hugged her head and screamed. After freeing herself from My's hand, haunted by her wild laughter, the girl quickly ran away. Passing by the crowd jostling to point at her now disheveled hair, they saw the girl rush straight into the tracks. While a train was passing by, the girl was immediately swept up by the train wheels, her body suddenly torn apart, crushed bones were scattered along the tracks. It was so sudden that no one had time to stop them. Just like that they left in fear. My also hurriedly ran away from the scene. Later, thanks to her family's conditions, she escaped being involved in this matter. My changed schools, and her mentality also became different from then on. It's almost like my became a new person. But the scene of the tragic accident still remained in her memory. No matter how many years passed, it still could not be erased. Currently, the person she saw after putting on the wig was none other than the unfortunate girl that day. That girl hasn't changed a bit. She still looks the same as 10 years ago. Her long hair covers her shoulders, her face is dazzlingly white. Against that white skin background were two bright red eyes, glaring viciously at the blood streaks so clear that the eyes seemed to bulge out. She was scared to death when she looked at that face. A few seconds later, it suddenly shattered, blood shot out in torrents. It felt like blood could shoot from the mirror to my body. She suddenly woke up, her whole body cold, sweat drenched her forehead, her palms clenched so tightly that they bled. What could be more terrifying than seeing a dead person appearing in the middle of a dream like that? My cringed. She wanted to scream, wanted to cry, but only the words you came out from her throat. Was like the sound of a girl crashing into a group of tourists, suddenly speechless. My covered her ears. She didn't want to hear that evil sound, but the more she covered, the more her mouth opened, as if an invisible hand was spreading her throat open. A few hours later, it was finally morning. The nurses came in to check and saw my sitting on the bed with her eyes wide open, covering her ears and mouth open. They shook her, and helped her lie down. My grabbed the nurse's hand and asked if Truong had come yet. She wanted to see him. The nurse shook her head. They didn't know when he would arrive. So throughout that day, my was like a lost soul, occasionally startled. Each time she frantically asked where Truong was, the nurse still patiently comforted her. But in my eyes, those were just lies, nothing more or less. She called Truong. He picked up the phone and said he had an unexpected business trip today. Don't wait for him, take medicine and go to bed early, tomorrow. Once finished, he will immediately go to the hospital to visit her. My hung up the phone. Her anxiety grew. Why did he go on a business trip at this time? He didn't even tell her. Was he also lying to her? Then my thought to herself, that's right, the nurse probably said he left her, he wanted to take him away from her, it made her crazy. As for the poison he gave her every day, it had no effect other than gradually killing her. When she became a degenerate, that nurse would snatch him away. We can't leave it like that, my thought as she bit the tip of her thumb. She bit until it bled without knowing. At that moment she just wanted to find a nurse to deal with her. And right at that moment of thinking, the nurse came in from outside. My smirked. What was he doing? She saw the nurse pushing a cart of snacks into the room. Oh, it also wants to poison your food, wants you to die quickly, there's no way you'll eat anything on it. The nurse used scissors to cut the bag of sponge cake. She handed the cake into My's hand and coaxed her to eat a little to regain her strength. My received the cake, she stared at the scissors on the tray. Suddenly she said, "Please give me a sip of water, I'm thirsty." The nurse nodded happily. As soon as she turned away, My quickly grabbed the scissors. She quietly got out of the bed and came close behind the nurse. Just as she turned around holding the glass of water, My immediately slammed the cake in her face, then pushed the nurse back. Her head hit the edge of the table, causing the nurse to be dizzy. My jumped up, grabbed her hair with one hand, and scissors in the other. She continuously cut the nurse's hair. When My's hand was full of hair, she quickly stood up, hid that hair in her shirt, and My rushed out of the hospital room. She saw many people walking in the hallway. The spontaneous thought at that time was to hide. She had to go find Truong. My tried to act natural. She quickly left the hospital, while the nurse was checking the patient room so no one paid attention to her. That's why My sneaked out smoothly. She followed her memory. Her steps were uncertain, but in her subconscious, My made herself on the right path. She would meet Truong. She would definitely meet her. The hospital discovered the nurse lying unconscious in My's hospital room. Although the injury was not too serious, her psychology was greatly affected. She panicked and recounted how everything happened at that time, how My acted, and finally she fainted and didn't know anything else. The hospital searched everywhere inside and out but couldn't find it. Through security cameras, they learned that My had left the hospital. Her family was contacted, informing them of the problem and discussing a solution. No matter how many times I tried to contact her, the result was still zero. Finally, they thought of calling Truong. Hearing the news, he couldn't wait to return home. The strange events of the past few days had greatly affected him. In the car, he tried to concentrate and not think about anything negative. By turning on the radio to listen to the news, he thought he would reduce his stress a little. The radio suddenly talked about the case of girl who committed suicide in her private room, and the hair they took from the girl's hand after forensic examination. People came to the conclusion that it was the hair of someone who died a long time ago. Coincidentally, in the accident they found the same hair sample. Truong didn't want that news to make him even more confused, so he immediately turned off the radio and stepped deeper on the gas pedal. What happened next made his bad premonition grow stronger. He called My back but couldn't get through. Something might have happened to her. Thinking about it made his heart cold. When he got to the hospital, the doctors told him the whole story. They also said they found medicine stuffed in the bed and under the bed was there a paper box. That was a hair box. Maybe My had brought it with her. That thing now suddenly became a deadly threat in Truong's eyes. He wasn't sure if it was harmful, but he had a feeling that her carrying it wasn't good at all. Truong hurriedly left the hospital. He got in the car to find her. But knowing where to go now, while he was mentally uncertain, his phone vibrated again. Truong quickly picked up the phone. On the other side was Huang. He announced that he had received My signal. Right on the road he just passed, 3 kilometers away, go left. Truong immediately turned the car around. If he went 3 kilometers, he would pass through the empty field. According to Truong's map, the place where My signal was detected was next to a residential area, there was a road right nearby, maybe she followed that path. At his fastest speed, Truong drove there. When he entered the residential area, he drove the car slowly, wanting to see if there was anyone like me on the road. Late at night it was quiet. On one side was a residential area with all the electricity turned off. Along the road there were only flashing light poles. Far away on the other side was the train line passing by. As he walked, he called the phone. If he was lucky, she might pick up the phone when she knew he was nearby. Wanting to observe both sides, Truong had to get out of the car. He ran along the residential area. Unable to calm down, he called out, "My! Hey My! I'm here to pick you up, My!" In response, there were only footsteps rustling on the road and the howling of the wind in the night, with a few dry ghost barking sounds somewhere. Suddenly, in the darkness on the train track, Truong saw a flickering light appear. "I've been calling all this time, I can see a little light like that, is it my?" Immediately he ran towards the source of the light, his steps were hurried, he shouted my name until his voice was hoarse, his throat was burned by the wind. It was indeed her, he could see the other person's back, her small, thin body. Truong shouted several times, then the person in front was startled and stopped. After leaving the hospital, Mai wandered along the asphalt road, where she headed towards the train line. Hearing the call, Mai slowly turned around. Facing her was Truong, 100 meters away. He couldn't see her clearly, but by the flashing light of his phone, he knew he had found her. Mai used the nurse's hair to cover her head, the loose strands fell all over her shoulders, the remaining strands on her head fell down, covering her face. Mai seemed to wake up from a trance. She saw Truong running towards her, her legs wobbled as if she wanted to stop, and said, "Mr. Truong, you finally came to see me. I'm here, don't go anywhere, I'm coming to pick you up," Truong said loud enough for Mai to hear his voice in the dark. "Do you think my hair is beautiful now? Do you like my hair this long? I like you anyway, I'm sorry, just stay there, I'll take you home, it's cold out here," Truong said through heavy breathing, his legs suddenly felt heavy. "Really? While speaking, Mai suddenly fell silent. Truong looked in panic. Not far away he heard the rumble of a train approaching. "Why did you lie to me? Why did you bring it here? You want to kill me, right?" Suddenly Mai shouted, her voice full of harshness, her legs jerked back. "Who?" Truong looked around in surprise, there was no one else here besides him. "He walked right next to you, clinging to your shoulder, clinging to the other brother, you still wanted to deceive me." Mai pointed straight at Truong, her words sent chills down his spine. "Who is it?" He looked around, it was completely empty, not even a ghost was there was no one else here. Thursday Mai felt different from him. She glared at the broken body clinging to his shoulder. His hair was flowing down to Truong's waist. His head was twisted, as if he couldn't hold his neck. With each step Truong came closer. She seemed to smell more clearly the strong smell of flesh and blood. It was hanging its arms over his shoulders and reaching for her, its body was not intact, separate pieces of skin were clinging to the bones of the arms. It stretched out its hand parallel to his arm, getting closer and closer, as if it could touch her right away. Mai stepped back, reaching the middle of the tracks. She only saw him screaming repeatedly, but she didn't know what he was saying. Her ears were ringing. In the blink of an eye, a light flashed, and everything immediately returned to quiet. Truong tried to tell her there was a train coming, he also wanted to run to grab my hand, but his legs could only move little by little, his whole body felt as heavy as a stone, his knees were weak, helplessly looking at her standing there. His voice was lost. Until the train lights illuminated Mi's body. A second later she turned into a pile of slime under the train wheels, and everything in him immediately went numb. Truong collapsed. Witnessing that terrible scene, he seemed to go crazy. My body was dragged 200 meters before it could stop. A long time later, Truong was still haunted by what happened that night. He had to quit his job to go to the hospital for treatment. Truong always seemed to hear what she said before the train arrived. "It walks right next to you." Truong looked to the sides again, front and back. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, his scalp was numb, and his whole body felt cold. "It hangs on my shoulder." Unconsciously, Truong touched his shoulder and back. There was nothing, but because there was nothing, he felt even more scared. "It grabbed my hand." Suddenly Truong brushed his hands, hair fell from somewhere to his feet, very long strands. The more he brushed, the more hair fell out. Terrified, Truong quickly ran into the bathroom. He splashed water on his arms, but the water flowed down his hands and turned red. Blood. Truong raised his head to look. What caught his eye was the bathroom mirror, on which he saw that he was not the only one. There was a head full of hair appearing right on his shoulder. Behind the hair is a broken face. No features are intact, the position is still messy. Truong looked intently at that face. Suddenly he shouted, "It's you." A moment later, people suddenly saw fire coming out of the apartment room on the 10th floor. The room was locked. The terrible fire heated the air. Inside the room there was a sound of someone screaming, but I couldn't hear it as a cry for help. If I tried to pay attention, I could see that it was, "I kill you, I kill you, you kill my lover, I have to kill you." When the fire was extinguished, people saw that the furniture in the room had burned to the point of being shapeless. Among the ashes, there was a shriveled body as black as coal. According to the investigation, the victim was Vu Din Truong, the owner of the apartment. 2 months ago, his lover was run over by a train and died. He was so shocked that he became mentally ill. The cause of the fire was because the victim doused himself in gasoline to burn himself. Luckily the fire did not spread to the surrounding houses. During the fire, a wig was found intact, but while being stored in the warehouse, the wig was stolen by thieves. There is nothing left to investigate in the case. Please close the file. Speaking of which, 10 years ago, after the girl ran into the train tracks out of panic and her body was broken into hundreds of pieces by a car, not long after, a hair collector passed by the scene. Accidentally seeing a pile of hair hidden in a hidden corner, she quickly grabbed it and sold it to a wig maker. That family immediately cleaned and nourished the hair to make it shiny. During the night of sewing the hair, the tailor accidentally let the sewing machine penetrate his hand, bringing with it the hair attached to the tip of the needle, penetrating the blood vessels. The next morning, the family discovered that the tailor had suddenly died. That hair was actually soaked in the tailor's blood. The soul of the girl who died prematurely came back to life inside it. People still unsuspectingly bought it and resold it many times. At first it just wanted to find the person who killed its owner, but over the years, there were people who deliberately cut or destroyed it, and later they all met a terrifying end. After 10 years, it seems that it doesn't even remember what its purpose of existence is. Sometimes people still see it appearing in the wig shop, waiting for the next unfortunate owner. Like a transitional circle, forever without end. This is the end of the story. Thank you for taking the time to follow.
Thank you for taking the time to watch Ghost Stories video. Hopefully the content has brought you interesting and meaningful moments. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the Ghost Stories YouTube channel to follow the channel's next videos. See you in the next video. Have a good day.